The views and opinions expressed on the following program are those of the host and guests and do not necessarily represent those of any organization, including One Generation Away.
The freedom of a people to choose its leaders is the root of liberty.
Keep alive this experiment in liberty.
Liberty, in case you've forgotten, is the soul's right to breathe.
Government should be very minimal in protecting liberty.
Peace cannot be purchased at the cost of liberty.
The sturdy ground of liberty.
Liberty once lost is lost forever.
Fight for their liberty and for our security.
Guarantees individual liberty.
This great republic, born alone in liberty.
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 Just how much do you want liberty?
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner,
a production of LibertyNation.com.
cutting through the double talk, taking on the topics, going after what the politicians really mean, and making it all clear. For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
The bloody boxing match known as the 2018 midterm elections goes 15 rounds and ends in a draw. Welcome back into Liberty Nation Radio, a production of LibertyNation.com and heard from coast to coast on the Radio American Network. We'll go to the heart of the matter in discussing the bottom line of Tuesday's split decision, the Democrats taking control of the House, the Republicans strengthening their majority in the Senate, and how, once again, Florida is in the spotlight as thousands of votes appear after election night in two key Democratic counties in the Senate race there, amid accusations by Republican Rick Scott of rampant fraud by election officials. Meanwhile, President Trump wastes no time after the elections in forcing the resignation of Attorney General Jeff Sessions and barring the grandstanding Jim Acosta of CNN from the White House. Graham Noble and Scott Cosenza of LibertyNation.com will join us along the way. So it was a good night for Democrats, sort of, and a good night for Republicans, kind of, and for President Trump, a night to celebrate the judicial branch of government. Records were broken for money spent, $6 billion, and in terms of turnout, probably the highest turnout for a midterm since 1966, when the Vietnam War was raging. So here are the most important takeaways from this split decision. First of all, Americans showed once again that they embrace divided government. Americans have long had an inherent suspicion of one-party rule. You know, history's demonstrated repeatedly that they prefer a balance of power, believing with good reason that giving too much control to a single party for too long has the look and feel of something less than democracy. That's why control of the legislature and presidency has been handed back and forth between the major parties for the entirety of American history, but particularly in this century. Elections in 2006, 8, 10, and 16 all resulted in dramatic shifts in power from one party to the other. Thus, while Tuesday's midterms hardly represented a blue wave, it was unsurprising that Americans affirmed their ongoing desire for providing balance in the political equation. Now, a second point is that Nancy Pelosi, or possibly another Democrat Speaker of the House, and House Democrats writ large will now have to decide between legislation and investigation. With their newfound majority in the lower chamber of Congress, Democrats who've hated on Trump from the day he was elected have threatened to unleash a torrent of investigations of the president into everything from his personal finances to his environmental and education and foreign policies. With the Senate, though, now dominated by the GOP, House Democrats know they'll be stopped and get almost nothing passed into law. They'll be blocked by the Senate. Now, this might well tempt them to go even further down the road of investigation, but it also endangers their prospects for 2020. Voters have made clear that they want things done and enough with the partisan witch hunts. But the likely chairs of key committees, foremost among them Adam Schiff in the House Intelligence Committee, Jerry Nadler in the House Judiciary Committee, And Maxine Waters in the Financial Services Committee may have other ideas. All of them have promised to investigate Trump and his administration with a microscope. And Mad Max Waters has famously made impeaching Trump her life's mission. Another key point, the far left had a bad night, but not as bad as it might look. All three of those high-profile progressives running for senator or governor were losers. Beto O'Rourke in Texas, Andrew Gillum in Florida, and Stacey Abrams in Georgia all came up short. But they all lost by 2 points or less in races that should have been slam dunks for the GOP. Texas and Georgia are solid red states, and Florida went for Trump in 2016. The near-miss performance of the far-left trio, O'Rourke, Gillum, and Abrams, and their ability to raise huge amounts of money should be a serious concern for conservatives. But at the same time, President Trump's impact on the judicial branch of government just got even larger. With a strengthened Republican majority in the Senate, 52 or 53 or maybe 54 seats instead of 51, and the Senate now requiring only a simple majority for confirmation of federal judges, the president should have a glide path in continuing his record pace of appointing judges, and he may even get a third Supreme Court pick before the dust clears. He'll no longer have to beg for votes from the likes of moderate Republicans like Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski. Meanwhile, the left had heart palpitations this week with word that their favorite justice, 85-year-old Ruth Bader Ginsburg, was hospitalized with fractured ribs, the result of a fall, but she was released a day later and is reportedly okay. In the end, though, this election consolidated the power of President Trump. It's undeniable that Trump's tireless campaigning, his electric campaign rallies before massive and adoring crowds, contributed mightily to Senate pickups by Trump-friendly candidates in Missouri and Indiana and Florida and perhaps Arizona. And his late appearance in Texas may just have saved Ted Cruz, who secured a surprisingly narrow victory over progressive godsend Beto O'Rourke. Now, given this infusion of reliable Trump loyalists in the Senate, the departure of Trump critics Jeff Flake and Bob Corker, and the retirement of 40 soft Republicans in the House before these elections, something unthinkable before November 8th, 2016 is now reality. The GOP has become truly the party of Donald Trump. Were those 40 Republicans who quit the House before the election responsible for the GOP losing the House? Will a Democrat House serve as the perfect foil for Donald Trump as he now prepares for his re-election campaign in 2020? We'll talk over those points and more about the 2018 midterms with LibertyNation.com chief political correspondent Graham Noble in a moment.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Exhausted by all the fake news? On LibertyNation.com's YouTube channel, facts and fresh, bold analysis are what you get without the leftist spin. Subscribe today to the LibertyNation.com YouTube channel and get our Truth is Making a Comeback. America's Top Stories. With LN Editor-in-Chief Lisa K. Donner, an alternative to the leftist programs on TV. 5 facts. Just the facts, ma'am. Without the liberal bias. LN Radio, syndicated from coast to coast on the Radio America Network. Listen to all the big names in politics with your host, Tim Donner. LN TV, the right analysis with our Liberty Nation authors from across the globe. The Uprising Podcast, fun and entertaining commentary on what's really going on in the swamp with Scott Cosenza and Tim Donner. All this and more when you subscribe to the LibertyNation.com YouTube channel today, because
Truth
Is making a
Comeback.
We believe that all men are entitled to the blessings of liberty.
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Well, it was a bloody 15-round boxing match which ended in a draw, with each side going back to its familiar or unfamiliar corner. Republicans with a stronger hand in the Senate, Democrats now in control of the House for the first time in 8 years. And here to break down the split decision that was the 2018 midterm elections from a number of angles is LibertyNation.com's chief political correspondent, Graham Noble. Hello, Graham.
Hi, Tim. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. Let's start out with a result from this election about which you and I disagree. Now, I say progressive candidates Beto O'Rourke, or Beto, Andrew Gillum, and Stacey Abrams came just this close to winning their elections in two deep red states, Texas and Georgia, and a state that Trump won in 2016, Florida. Raised a ton of money, that trio did, and that should make conservatives very nervous. But you view these losses on the far left differently, yes?
Yes, to a certain extent I do, Tim. I mean, I think your point is well taken. I guess I'm looking at it from the point of view of what the actual result was.
Well, and also the amount of money that they spent. I mean, the point that you made when we were together on the Liberty Nation TV roundtable is that they spent just, I mean, millions and tens of millions of dollars. I mean, Beto O'Rourke raised over, $70 million, and the money came flooding into Andrew Gillum in his race for Senate, for governor in Florida, Stacey Abrams for her race in Georgia. And these are far-left candidates that were able to raise a ton of money. And you can either look at it that, wow, the fundraising capacity should be scary for conservatives. But you could look at it the way that you do, which is that, boy, they spent all this money, and all these progressives, including Obama, put their reputations and their money on the line and came up short.
I think you raise one point which is very good, and that is the fundraising ability that's going into these candidates is terrifying, actually. I mean, it's scary just even from a non-partisan point of view. Just the sheer fact that we as a nation are spending this much money on these elections, and it seems to get increasingly so. You know, every time they come around, we hear on the news once again, this is the most expensive election, in history, and we keep hearing that. And I think that's scary that much money is going in. The fact that the left is able to pour that much money in should be of huge concern for the Republicans.
So, Graham, it's clear that the 40 retirements by moderate Republicans mostly in the House contributed a lot to the Democrats taking over the House. Would things have turned out differently if the GOP had, say, half that number retiring?
Well, it's an interesting question, Tim. And I have to say that there's no clear-cut answer to that, actually. I mean, it's even I myself, I'm tempted to believe that that made the Republicans' chances of retaining control of the House of Representatives a lot more difficult. That number of retirements, either people just retiring or leaving to seek another office, or for whatever reason that they're leaving, that was a large number. 8 of those retirements were from districts that actually voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016. So those 8 particularly left the GOP in a tough spot. Historically, when you look back at the elections and at the number of retirements from each party and whether or not they affected the outcome of the election, it's a tough call. I've actually been looking at the numbers, and there's no absolute correlation between the number of retirements from one party or the other and whether or not they won or lost an election.
Okay, fair enough. Now that the Democrats do have control of the House with a pickup of really about the historical norm. It's going to be in and around 30 seats, which is the average for the out-of-power party to pick up in a midterm election in the first term of a new president. Do you expect the House leadership to primarily investigate or primarily to legislate, given the fact that the Senate, controlled by Republicans, can block almost anything that they pass?
Yeah, it's such an interesting, for want of a better word, an interesting position for that the Democrats now find themselves in, because partly they almost have to cater to their more radical supporters by going after the president himself, going after members of his administration, and going after the Republicans in general, by basically weaponizing these congressional committees and holding endless hearings and relitigating all kinds of things. Most Democratic voters did not send Democratic representatives to Washington to investigate every time the president sneezes. They've got to do some legislating, even though, as you said, the Republicans actually have a slightly larger majority in the Senate now. They can, they've already got a pile of bills that even the Republican House sent them that they haven't dealt with yet. So it's like they've almost got a backlog now. How the Democrats think they're going to get any legislation that they write through the Senate is beyond me.
Well, indeed. I mean, they know that they can try to legislate any issue they want, but if it is anything outside of possibly infrastructure or perhaps criminal justice reform, the Republicans in the Senate are not going to be amenable to that, to be sure. But there's also a school of thought, Graham, that Trump will actually improve his chances for re-election in 2020 by having this Democrat House as a foil, somebody to run against. That'll strengthen his hand. Do you buy into that narrative?
Yeah, I think it's hard to deny that is a very distinct possibility. And once again, it really comes down to how the Democrats conduct themselves now. I suspect that they will spend more of their time investigating. They'll spend more of their time in the committee chambers, grandstanding and having Spartacus moments and
yes,
and pointing the fingers, because if they get called out for not having done much legislation over the next 2 years, they can always do that, because somehow the Democrats have a knack of managing to blame the Republicans for being obstructionist. Even when President Obama first came to office, and he had a Democratic Senate and a Democratic House, and yet somehow they still managed to blame the Republicans for obstructing everything and for them not being able to get anything done. So they will do that, yeah, absolutely.
Okay, well, thank you for joining us, Graham. We'll keep a close eye, of course, you and I and others at LibertyNation.com on how this all breaks out. There's already been major headlines since the election, so we'll move forward together. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Tim.
Graham Noble of LibertyNation.com. Up next, our signature segment, Say What, featuring election fallout. Trump taunts Republican losers. CNN on the rampage. And yet another new low for left-wing comedians.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
We believe that all men are entitled to blessings of liberty.
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Liberty Nation Radio, syndicated from coast to coast on the Radio America Network. And a shout out to those of you listening on WECZ 1540 AM in Punxsutawney, Pennsylvania, home of the groundhog. I think my favorite all-time movie is Groundhog Day. Required viewing, folks, if you haven't seen it. I've seen it, 20 times.
Say what? Say what? Say what? One more time.
Say What, the portion of Liberty Nation Radio where we roll out some of the most wacky, astonishing, and damnable things uttered by politicians and the chattering class. Even CNN had to admit that Democrats hoping for a blue wave or blue tsunami were disappointed on Tuesday night. Here's Chief Political Correspondent Gloria Borger.
There's no tsunami. There's no tsunami coming. I mean, winning the House by one vote, by one member is enough for them. But there's a lot of disappointment that I'm hearing from people. I'm also hearing talk about recounts in Florida. Can you believe it?
Believe it. Shades of hanging chads, recounts dragging on forever. The 2000 presidential election, Florida in the spotlight again. Republican Rick Scott appeared to have won the Senate race there, but thousands of votes from Palm Beach and Broward counties, both Democrat strongholds, started appearing after election night. So the counting continues, and Scott said it's an outrage.
It has been over 48 hours since the polls closed, and Broward and Palm Beach counties are still finding and counting ballots. And the supervisors, Brenda Snipes and Susan Booker, could not seem to say how many ballots still exist and where these ballots came from or where they have been. Every Floridian should be concerned there may be rampant fraud happening in Palm Beach and Broward counties.
Yes, the Democrat lawyers have descended on South Florida, and when these new votes stop pouring in, nobody knows. Meanwhile, once again, President Trump broke the mold at his post-election press conference, doing something we've never seen before, taunting the members of his own party who refused his embrace and lost.
You had some that decided to, let's stay away. They did very poorly. I'm not sure that I should be happy or sad, but I feel just fine about it. Mike Kaufman. Too bad, Mike. Mia Love gave me no love. And she lost. Too bad. Sorry about that, Mia. And Barbara Comstock was another one. I mean, I think she could have won that race, but she didn't want to have any embrace. She lost, substantially lost.
Well, didn't that just set the media ablaze? Particularly, of course, CNN and one of their bevy of Trump haters, Jake Tapper.
The president started out by doing a dance on the graves of Republicans who did not show him enough fealty. I've never seen a president take delight in people of his own party losing. And the only thing I can say compare that to is, some of the works of Francis Ford Coppola or Martin Scorsese. I mean, that's how gangsters act. The idea that you're not loyal to them and therefore you deserve the punishment.
I don't like it when you don't accept my embrace. Shades of The Godfather. But it was later that same day when another Trump-deranged CNN correspondent, the infamous grandstanding Jim Acosta, made a spectacle of himself again, and this time went too far.
One of the statements that you made in the tail end of the campaign in the midterms, that
here we go.
If you don't mind, Mr. President, that this caravan was an invasion. As you know, Mr. President,
I consider it to be an invasion.
As you know, Mr. President, the caravan was not an invasion. It's a group of migrants moving up from Central America towards the border with the U.S.
Thank you for telling me that.
They're hundreds of miles away, though. They're hundreds and hundreds of miles away. That's not an invasion.
Honestly, I think you should let me run the country. You run CNN.
All right.
And if you did it well, your ratings would be much better.
If I may ask one other question, Mr. President, if I may ask one other question, are you worried?
That's enough. That's enough.
Mr. President, I was going to ask one of the other folks.
That's enough.
Pardon me, ma'am. Mr. President,
that's enough.
Mr. President, I had one other question, if I may ask, on the Russia investigation. Are you concerned that you may have?
I'm not concerned about anything with the Russian investigation because it's a hoax. I'll tell you what, CNN should be ashamed of itself having you working for them.
In the middle of that diatribe by Acosta, he pushed away a White House intern and then had his White House press credentials stripped. But Acosta wasn't the only one using the press briefing to advance their own point of view. Here's a reporter from PBS.
Hi, Mr. President. Yami Shalsunder with PBS NewsHour. On the campaign trail, you called yourself a nationalist. Some people saw that as emboldening white nationalists. Now people are also saying that the president.
It's such a racist
There
question.
are some people that say that now the Republican Party is seen as supporting white nationalists because of your rhetoric. What do you make of that?
I don't believe it. I don't know. Why do I have my highest poll numbers ever with African Americans?
Probably because black unemployment is at the lowest level ever recorded. But that was hardly the end of an eventful day after the election. The president forced the resignation of Attorney General Jeff Sessions, who was on the chopping block from the moment he recused himself from oversight of the investigation by special counsel Robert Mueller. And longtime GOP Congressman Trey Gowdy was hardly surprised.
It was going to happen. I knew it was going to happen after the election. I did not think it would happen before all the votes had been counted. But he's been a proverbial dead man walking for several months now.
And so the president has named Jeff Sessions' chief of staff, Matthew Whitaker, as acting attorney general for the time being, which led to an immediate complaint from Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer.
Protecting Mueller and his investigation is paramount. It would create a constitutional crisis if this were a prelude to ending or greatly limiting the Mueller investigation. And I hope President Trump and those he listens to will refrain from that. I find the timing very suspect.
There you go. A constitutional crisis. On the left, everything is these days. Finally, evidence of the supposed compassion of the left on Saturday Night Live, which has become, like other late-night shows, a Trump hate fest. They made fun of a Republican who was wounded in battle and wears an eye patch.
This guy's kind of cool, Dan Crenshaw.
Oh, come on, man.
Yo, hold on. You may be surprised to hear he's a congressional candidate from Texas and not a hitman in a porno movie. I'm sorry, I know he lost his eye in war or whatever. Whatever.
There, my friends, is the American left circa 2018. Quick break, and then we're back to discuss the changing of the guard at the Department of Justice and what happened with those ballot initiatives all over the country.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
And now we welcome you to the ultimate segment of Liberty Nation Radio, which we entitled Talkin' Liberty. We're going to talk an awful lot of liberty as we welcome in our regular correspondent, LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor and constitutional lawyer, of course, Scott Cosenza. Hello, Scott.
Hello, Tim.
Okay, big changes the day after the election in the Department of Justice with Jeff Sessions, who was referred to by his colleague Trey Gowdy as being dead man walking for months now at the Department of Justice, is out, and Matt Whitaker is in as acting attorney general. So he's going to exercise oversight in the special counsel investigation. How might that be different than before when it was in the hands of Deputy AG Rod Rosenstein?
I think that is a bit too far into the tea leaves, Tim, except to say that how it will be different is he'll be more hyper aware of the intense scrutiny that's going to be placed on his every decision, I think. He did start off as a politician or a politician wannabe, which is to say that he's not a career justice official.
Right.
He ran for the U.S. Senate. And so he's going to be a little bit more attuned to the political considerations, I think, than will Rod Rosenstein, who, while certainly is in a political job, is not about the retail politics.
It seemed, though, that Trump has established a pretty good relationship with Rod Rosenstein. He seems to trust him and embrace him. Now, that may just be for political purposes because he wants the special counsel final report to reflect positively, and he has no reason to be hostile towards Rosenstein, at least publicly.
What goes on behind closed doors there, Tim, is anybody's guess. It seems like there's at least a detente, though, which is workable. I mean, certainly the work of the Justice Department does not need to be day-to-day managed by the president. A competent attorney general is what we need in place, and whether we can find one in this replacement or not, I think remains to be seen.
Jeff Sessions didn't leave many footprints in the sand, did he?
It doesn't seem so. He was hemmed in by Trump on the marijuana thing, which he seemed poised, Tim, to really go full hog on in terms of enforcing federal marijuana laws, which were generally not enforced in many instances where it's state legal under the Obama Holder Justice Department. But he got hemmed in by Trump on that. And so really the only thing I think is his lasting legacy that I can think of in the news is the sadly the immigration issues, which I don't think, no matter how you feel about them in terms of the legal side of things, you can't walk away with a happy face after having to do that business.
I mean, it was all downhill for Jeff Sessions when he failed to or refused to tell the president that he would immediately recuse himself from a special counsel investigation were one to happen. And when he did, it was all downhill for Sessions from there. He was criticized a lot by the president publicly, and I think this was clearly the best workout of an uncomfortable situation.
Can I interrupt with a point there,
yes.
Tim? I don't know that it's appropriate to say that he refused to tell him. I don't know that he knew that he would have. In other words, I don't know that he knew that recusal was coming until it actually happened. You'll recall that he was accused of meeting with some Russians. It turns out they were in like a reception line at some event. The Democrats made and it's actually his honorability, I think, that, for all of Jeff Sessions' flaws, I think he actually adheres to the code that he espouses. And that's what drove his recusal. And so I don't celebrate the man for much, Tim, but I do celebrate him for that.
Meanwhile, the president's war with the media erupted. Again, the day after the election, after the changeover of attorney generals and the resignation of Jeff Sessions, we had Jim Acosta put on another one of his grandstanding displays at the White House, refusing to turn over the microphone to another reporter. He laid his hand on an intern who was trying to take the mic from him, and has since been suspended now from his beat as White House reporter for CNN. So this has now taken yet another turn for the worse, the relationship between Trump and the media. What is the state of freedom of the press circa November 2018, Scott?
I don't think this is a hiccup on the state of freedom of the press, this event per se, Tim. This is the case of a personality conflict. If you want to, I think, be charitable to the situation, or it's a problem with either Mr. Trump or Mr. Acosta or both. If you want to be less than charitable, I don't know that it has a lasting impact, though, on freedom of speech issues. While President Trump often, and in a manner that I criticized before and I criticize now, speaks in derogatory terms about various aspects of freedom of speech, he has done nothing to jeopardize it from its legal perspective, which, let's recall that our Constitution does not protect us from bad talk about speech, but actions impinging upon freedom of speech. And we have seen none so far from the Trump administration, unlike, I want to say, in marked contrast to the Obama administration. Obama was the worst president on free speech perhaps since Nixon. I don't know. I have to think about that one. But he was really terrible, including the jailing of reporters and authorizing the placement, bugging their computers. Really disgusting. So right now, as far as I'm concerned, there's been no impact, Tim, in a negative way, except for this, tempest in a teapot between Acosta and Trump. So right now, as far as I'm concerned, there's been no impact, Tim, in a negative way, except for this, tempest in a teapot between Acosta and Trump.
I've said it before, and I'll say it again. If Trump would simply replace the in the media is the enemy of the people with the word this and saying this media is the enemy of the people, I think he would draw he would create a larger tent of people who would be inside the tent rather than saying the media is the enemy of the people. I think we all know that he means the fake news media, like CNN is the enemy of the people, but he needs to state it a little more clearly if he wants to continue his justifiable attacks on the press for their biased coverage. Over 90% negative coverage of Trump in the elite media. But Let's move on now to ballot initiatives, which were overlooked and often are in these midterm elections. Quick summary. Voters in Utah, Idaho, and Nebraska voted to expand Medicaid. Michigan legalized marijuana. Nebraska and Missouri raised the minimum wage. Criminal Justice Amendment 11 in Florida will make reforms retroactive. Louisiana now requiring unanimous jury verdicts in felony cases. In Colorado, voters abolished unpaid prison labor. Let's focus first on the Second Amendment. And how did the Second Amendment and gun rights fare on Election Day?
I think that the Second Amendment fared very well in terms of its immediate future protection, Tim, from the pro-gun perspective. We had a number of anti-gun senators, both incumbents and prospects, who were rejected at the polls, and in which gun control was a principal component of their campaigns.
Right.
And we have so a number of anti-gun senators didn't win, and a number of anti-gun senators lost their seats to pro-gun senators elect. So for all those reasons, I think it was a big win in terms of protections. Obviously, the Democrats will come for guns in the House, but their proposals will go nowhere with a strong majority, well, relatively strong majority, at least compared to recent history, in the Senate for Republicans. 53, possibly 54 seats once Arizona is determined. Yeah, and they're not Arlen Specter, or I don't know if that's too old to use as an example, but Republicans who won't who we have to be questioned about how their vote will be on gun control.
Well, the new senators from North Dakota and Indiana and Florida, they all owe a lot to Trump because he campaigned heavily.
And the gun rights organizations.
And the gun rights organizations as well.
And the people that basically put them there.
It's clearly a more pro-Trump and a more pro-Second Amendment Senate than it was before.
Agreed. Can we talk for just a second about that Florida criminal justice initiative, Tim?
Let's do that because it says making reforms retroactive. So
the important takeaway here, I think, Tim, is if we look at the results of the Florida gubernatorial and senatorial elections, they were very narrow margins of victory. Well, the felons in Florida will now be allowed to vote. So this activates voting rights for all felons in Florida. There are enough felons in Florida to make the difference in these votes if they come out to vote.
As somebody said, if that had been passed before this election, we'd be talking about Governor Andrew Gillum in Florida.
That's exactly right. And I think it's really going to be a sea change in that state, which is narrowly divided now. They just added a lot more votes to the pile. And most of those, we presume, are going to be Democrat votes.
So, Scott, how many states now have legal recreational use and sale of marijuana?
Well, with Michigan, Tim, that became the 10th state, so 10.
Okay, thank you, Scott.
Thank you, Tim.
This program, Liberty Nation Radio, plus LibertyNation.com's own podcast, The Uprising, hosted by Scott and me and Lisa K. Donner, are available to you on demand at LibertyNation.com and from fine podcast providers everywhere. And we'll be drilling deep, Scott and I, into the election on this week's edition of The Uprising. So that is it for this week, but we'll be back at you next week, same time, same station. Till then, this is Tim Donner saying stand up for liberty, and we'll see you next time on Liberty Nation Radio.